There are things in your past you wish had never happened. There are sins you regret, mistakes that haunt you. The enemy whispers that it's too late, that you are disqualified. But listen closely. This is not the voice of God. There are things in life that seem beyond repair. Mistakes that have been made, paths that have been taken, choices that led to ruin. And when you look back, you might think, if only I had done things differently. But what if those very things, the ones that seem to have destroyed so much, were not just forgiven, not just erased, but transformed into something good? What if the very things the enemy meant for your destruction were the very things God was waiting to use for your destiny? It's not just that he redeems. It's not just that he restores. He does something greater. He takes the very thing that was meant for evil and turns it into good. That's the mystery of redemption. It's not just about erasing your past. It's about transforming it. He doesn't just make your story clean, he makes it powerful. He doesn't just remove your failures, he weaves them into his divine plan. Look at Joseph. His brothers hated him. They threw him into a pit. They sold him into slavery. He was falsely accused, imprisoned, forgotten. If anyone had reason to believe that his life had been ruined, that his past had destroyed his future, it was Joseph. And yet, in the end, the very things that should have broken him were the very things that positioned him to fulfill his destiny. Had his brothers never betrayed him, he never would have been taken to Egypt. Had he never been falsely accused, he never would have been placed in the prison where he met the cupbearer. Had he never been forgotten, he never would have been called upon to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And had he never stood before Pharaoh, he never would have been placed in the position that saved an entire nation from famine, including the very brothers who betrayed him. The very thing that was meant for evil became the very thing that led to salvation. Joseph himself said it, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That is the pattern. That is how God works. And what about Moses, a man who was raised in the house of Pharaoh but ran in fear after committing murder? He spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, believing that he had lost his calling, that he had missed his purpose. But the very wilderness that seemed like a curse was the very thing that prepared him for his mission. The same desert he walked for 40 years as a shepherd was the same desert he would later lead his people through as their deliverer. His time in exile was not a waste, it was a preparation. And what about Peter, the disciple who swore he would never deny the Lord? Yet in the moment of testing, he did exactly that. He failed. He fell. He wept bitterly. And yet it was Peter, the very one who had denied his master, who was chosen to stand before the crowds on the day of Pentecost and proclaim the gospel with such power that 3,000 souls were saved in a single day. His failure did not disqualify him. His failure became the very thing that humbled him, refined him, and prepared him for his calling. And then there's Paul, a man who persecuted believers, a man who approved the killing of the righteous, a man whose past was drenched in the blood of the innocent. If anyone should have been beyond redemption, it was him. But the very thing that made him unworthy became the very thing that made him the greatest witness to the power of grace. His former zeal in persecuting the church became a greater zeal in advancing it. His deep knowledge of the law, once used to condemn believers, became the very thing that allowed him to reveal the mysteries of grace hidden within it. The man who once brought death to the saints became the man who brought life to the world through the gospel. And so it is with you. The sins of your past, the wounds, the failures, the regrets, these are not just things to be forgiven and forgotten. No, they are things to be transformed. What was meant for your destruction, God will use for your calling. What was meant to bring shame, God will use for his glory. What was meant to be your downfall, God will use as your testimony. Because this is what he does. He does not just wipe the slate clean. He writes a new story. He does not just erase your past. He makes it into something greater than you could ever imagine. The enemy thought he had won when Joseph was thrown into a pit. The enemy thought he had won when Moses ran into the wilderness. The enemy thought he had won when Peter denied Christ. The enemy thought he had won when Paul persecuted the church. But the enemy was wrong. Because the very thing he tried to use for evil became the very thing God used for good. And if he did it for them, he will do it for you. There are things in your life that you carry, wounds, scars, the marks of past mistakes. You try to move forward, but the memory of what was still lingers. The enemy tells you that your past disqualifies you, that your wounds make you weak, that your failures have marked you forever. But the truth is the opposite. The very things that once brought you shame, the very wounds that once threatened to destroy you, are the very things God will use for His glory. They will become your testimony. Consider the story of Thomas, the disciple who doubted. He was not there when the risen Messiah appeared to the others. He had seen too much, experienced too much loss. He had believed once before, and it had ended with a cross. So he said, "Unless I see the wounds in His hands and put my fingers where the nails were, I will not believe." But when the risen Messiah came, He did not rebuke Thomas for his doubt. Instead, He showed him His wounds. The scars of the crucifixion had not disappeared. They remained, and it was in those wounds that Thomas found his faith restored. Why did the Messiah keep His wounds? Why did He not rise with a body that bore no trace of suffering? Because the wounds were now part of the victory. The very marks that testified of His suffering became the marks that testified of His resurrection. The very scars that spoke of death became the proof of life. The wounds became the testimony, and so it is with you. The things you have been through, the sins you have repented of, the struggles you have faced, they do not disappear, but they are transformed. They become the testimony of what God has done in your life. Look at the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. She was ashamed, avoiding the crowds, coming to the well at the hottest hour of the day just to escape the eyes of others. She had been married 5 times. She was living with a man who was not her husband. She was an outcast. She had a past that defined her. And yet it was to her that the Messiah first revealed Himself as the Christ. And what did she do? She ran back into the very town that had rejected her, the very place where she was an outcast, and she cried out, "Come and see the man who told me everything I ever did." Her past was no longer a source of shame. It became the testimony that led an entire village to salvation. Had she not been broken, had she not been wounded, she would not have recognized the one who could heal her. Had she not been thirsty, she would not have recognized the living water when it stood before her. The very thing that had once marked her as unworthy became the very thing that God used to bring salvation to others. And what about Peter? The disciple who swore he would never deny the Lord, who declared that even if all others abandoned him, he would remain. But on the night of testing, he failed. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And when the rooster crowed, he went out and wept bitterly. He had failed the one he loved the most. He had been given an opportunity to stand, and he had fallen. But after the resurrection, the Messiah came to him and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And 3 times, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." 3 times he had denied, and 3 times he had denied, and 3 times he was restored. And then the Messiah entrusted him with the greatest mission of all. "Feed my sheep." The same Peter who had failed, the same Peter who had denied him, was the one chosen to stand before the crowds on the day of Pentecost and preach the gospel with such power that 3,000 souls were saved. His failure did not disqualify him. His failure became the very thing that made him humble, the very thing that gave him compassion, the very thing that prepared him to lead others. And then there's Paul, a man who persecuted the church, who approved the stoning of Stephen, who dragged believers from their homes and threw them into prison. If anyone had a past that should have disqualified him, it was Paul. And yet it was Paul who wrote, "Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst." He did not hide his past. He did not pretend it had never happened. He used it. He used it to show the depths of God's mercy. He used it to proclaim that if God could save him, then no one was beyond redemption. The very thing that should have made him unworthy became the testimony that made him the greatest witness of grace. And so it is with you. Your wounds, your past, your failures, these are not things that disqualify you. They are the very things God will use. They are the testimony that will bring others to salvation. The very thing the enemy wanted to use to destroy you is the very thing God will use to bring life. Because the wounds of the past, when placed in His hands, become the marks of victory. There are moments in life when you look back and wonder how much time has been wasted. You think of the years spent in sin, in rebellion, in wandering. You think of the opportunities lost, the doors closed, the time that can never be recovered. You wonder what could have been if only you had chosen differently. The enemy whispers that it's too late, that the time is gone, that you can never get it back. But the enemy is a liar. Because in the hands of God, Nothing is wasted. In the hands of God, even the years that seem lost can be redeemed. There is a mystery in the way God works, a mystery that is beyond human understanding. When something is lost in the natural world, it is gone. Time moves in one direction, and once a moment has passed, it cannot be reclaimed. But the ways of God are not the ways of the world. He does not just move forward in time. He redeems it. He does not just restore what was lost. He makes it as if it had never been lost at all. Look at the story of Joel. The land had been devastated. The locusts had come and stripped everything bare. There was nothing left. The fields were empty, the trees barren, the harvest destroyed. Years of labor had been consumed, and there was no way to bring it back. But then came the word of the Lord. I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. Not just the crops, not just the fields, not just the fruit, the years. The time itself. It was not simply a promise of new blessings. It was a promise to redeem what had already been lost. And what about Abraham and Sarah? They were given a promise, a son, a legacy, a nation. But the years passed and nothing happened. They waited, and still, there was nothing. It seemed like the time had been wasted. It seemed like the promise had passed them by. They grew old. The hope faded. The world would have said that it was too late, that the time was gone, that it could never happen now. But when the promise was finally fulfilled, it was as if the delay had never been. Isaac was born in a time when it should have been impossible. And through him, the promise was fulfilled just as God had spoken. The years that seemed lost were redeemed. And then there's Moses. He was called from birth to be a deliverer. Raised in the palace of Pharaoh, he was positioned for greatness. But one wrong decision, one act of anger, and he fled into the wilderness. He became a shepherd in a foreign land. Years passed, decades. He had once been a prince. Now he was tending sheep. The dreams of his youth were gone. The calling seemed like a distant memory. And yet, after 40 years in the wilderness, God appeared to him in the burning bush and said, now, the time was not wasted. The years in the wilderness had prepared him for what was to come. The delay was not a denial. The years were redeemed. And then there's the prodigal son. He took his inheritance. He squandered it. He wasted it all on reckless living. He reached the lowest point, feeding pigs, starving, covered in filth. The time was gone. The inheritance spent. There was no way to undo what had been done. But when he returned to his father, something happened. The father did not scold him. He did not make him earn his way back. He ran to him, embraced him, clothed him in a robe, put a ring on his finger and said, "This son of mine was dead and is alive again." He was lost and is found. And in that moment, it was as if he had never been gone. The time was restored. The sonship was restored. The years were redeemed. And then there is the greatest redemption of all. Mankind had fallen. Sin had entered the world. The years of separation from God stretched on and on. The enemy thought he had won. He thought the time was gone, that the damage was irreversible, that what had been lost in Eden could never be regained. But then came the Messiah. And in one moment, in one sacrifice, in one act of love, he redeemed it all. What was lost was found. What was broken was restored. What seemed beyond hope was made new. This is how he works. What you thought was wasted, he redeems. What you thought was lost, he restores. What you thought was beyond repair, he makes whole. The enemy tells you that the time is gone, but in the hands of God, no time is ever truly lost. The years that the locusts have eaten, he will restore. What seemed like delay was preparation. What seemed like a detour was the path to your destiny. The story is not over. The time is not lost, because he is the God who redeems the years. The greatest act of sin in human history was not committed by a single person. It was not the failure of a man or the rebellion of a nation. It was something far greater, far darker, something beyond human comprehension. It was the moment when mankind took the very Son of God, the Holy One, the Messiah, and nailed him to a cross. The one who had healed the sick, who had opened blind eyes, who had raised the dead, was betrayed, mocked, beaten, and crucified. The very hands that had touched lepers and made them clean were pierced with nails. The very feet that had walked upon the waters were fastened to a wooden beam. The voice that had spoken life into the dead was silenced in death. The world had done the unthinkable. The creation had slain its creator. The enemy must have rejoiced. The kingdom of darkness must have celebrated. The forces of evil must have believed they had won, because what could be greater than this? If sin is separation from God, then what sin could be greater than murdering God himself? If sin brings death, then what death could be greater than the death of the author of life? It was the ultimate crime, the ultimate rebellion, the ultimate darkness. And yet, in that very moment, something was happening that no one could see. Because what seemed to be the greatest act of evil was actually the greatest act of redemption. What seemed to be the moment of defeat was actually the moment of victory. It had been foretold from the beginning. In the garden, when sin first entered the world, God spoke of one who would come. The seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, but in doing so, his heel would be bruised. The suffering would be real. The pain would be real. But in the very act of being struck, he would bring the ultimate defeat of darkness. The prophet spoke of it. Isaiah saw it centuries before it came to pass. He wrote of a servant who would be despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, one who would bear our iniquities, who would be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our sins, crushed for our sins, one upon whom the punishment for our peace would rest, and by whose wounds we would be healed. But Isaiah also saw something else. He saw that the suffering of this servant was not in vain. He saw that he would see the fruit of his labor and be satisfied. He saw that what appeared to be the greatest injustice of all time was actually the means by which many would be made righteous. And so it was. The cross was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was not a tragedy. It was the plan of God. From the foundation of the world, the Lamb was slain. The greatest act of sin in human history became the very thing that brought redemption to the world. The greatest darkness became the greatest light. The greatest loss became the greatest victory. That is the mystery of redemption. God does not simply defeat sin. He uses it. He takes what was meant for evil and turns it for good. He takes the very thing that was supposed to destroy and makes it the means by which he saves. He did it with Joseph when the betrayal of his brothers led to their own salvation. He did it with Moses when his exile became the preparation for his calling. He did it with Peter when his greatest failure became the foundation of his greatest ministry. And he did it with the cross when the greatest act of darkness became the very thing that brought salvation to the world. The blood that was shed in shame became the blood that cleanses. The wounds that were inflicted in cruelty became the wounds that heal. The death that was meant to silence the voice of God became the very thing that spoke the loudest. And the grave that was meant to hold him became the very proof that he had conquered death. And if he did this with the cross, if he took the greatest sin and turned it into the greatest blessing, then what can he not do with your life? What sin can be beyond his power to redeem? What failure can be beyond his ability to restore? What darkness can be beyond his ability to turn into light? The enemy meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The very thing that was supposed to bring destruction becomes the very thing he uses to bring life. The very thing that was supposed to end the story becomes the beginning of something greater, because that is who he is. The God who takes the cross and makes it the key to redemption. The God who takes sin and turns it into salvation. The God who turns death into resurrection. The God who turns sorrow into joy. The God who turns what was meant for evil into good. There are moments in life when you look at yourself and wonder how God could ever use you. You remember the things you've done, the ways you have fallen, the times you turned away from him. You think about the words you spoke in anger, the choices you made in weakness, the temptations you gave into, and the enemy whispers, "You are not worthy. You are not qualified. You are too broken, too sinful, too far gone." But the enemy is a liar, because in the hands of God, brokenness does not disqualify. It qualifies. The wounds, the failures, the sins of the past do not make you useless. They are the very things that prepare you for your calling. Look at the story of David. He was a shepherd, overlooked, unseen. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king, even David's own father did not consider him. And yet, God chose him. But David was not perfect. He rose to greatness, but he also fell. He committed sin, terrible sin. He took another man's wife and had that man killed to cover it up. If anyone should have been disqualified, it was him. And yet, God still called him a man after his own heart. He'd always return to be the end of his story or be the end of his story because he repented. And in the hands of God, even the deepest failure can be redeemed. And what about Rahab? She was a prostitute. She lived in a city destined for destruction. She was part of a people under judgment. And yet, when the spies came to Jericho, She hid them. She risked everything to align herself with the people of God. She was not righteous by her own deeds. She had a past. She had a reputation. But when she chose to put her trust in the God of Israel, her past did not define her future. She was not only saved from destruction, she became part of the lineage of the Messiah himself. The very woman who had once lived in sin became a part of the story of redemption. And then there's Jonah. He went in the opposite direction. He fled from God's presence. He ended up in the belly of a great fish, swallowed up in the depths of the sea. It should have been the end. But God had other plans. Even in his rebellion, even in his disobedience, God did not give up on him. He was given another chance, and when he finally obeyed, an entire city repented. Even his failure, even his running away was used to bring him to a place of surrender. And what about Matthew? A tax collector, a man despised by his own people. Tax collectors were seen as traitors, as corrupt, as sinners beyond redemption. No one would have chosen him. No one would have looked at him and seen a disciple. But when the Messiah passed by and said, "Follow me," Matthew left everything behind. The very man who had once taken from his own people was now called to give the good news of salvation. The very profession that had made him an outcast became the thing that showed the power of grace. And he was the one chosen to write one of the Gospels. The one the world had rejected became a messenger of the greatest truth. And then there's the woman caught in adultery. She was dragged before the crowd, condemned, humiliated, exposed. The law said she should be stoned. The people were ready to destroy her. But the Messiah knelt down, wrote in the dust, and then spoke the words that silenced them all. "I'll let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, they walked away. And when he looked at her, he did not see her as they did. He did not see her as an outcast, as a failure, as someone beyond redemption. He saw her as a daughter. He saw what she could become, not just what she had been. "Neither do I condemn you," he said. "Go and sin no more." And in that moment, her past was no longer her identity. Her sin was not the end of her story. And so it is with you. The enemy wants you to believe that your past disqualifies you, but the truth is the opposite. The very things that the enemy meant to destroy you are the things God will use to build you. The very wounds that were meant to break you are the wounds through which his light will shine. The very failures that seem to mark your downfall are the very things he will turn into a testimony, because that is how he works. He does not call the perfect. He does not choose the flawless. He does not wait for you to be worthy. He takes the broken and makes them whole. He takes the unqualified and qualifies them. He takes the sinner and makes them a saint. He takes what was meant for shame and turns it into glory. The enemy thought your past would be the end of you, but in the hands of God, your past becomes the very thing that reveals his grace. There are moments in life when you wonder if you have strayed too far. You think of the choices you made, the things you said, the roads you walked that led you away from God. You wonder if he still sees you, if he still hears you, if he still has a place for you in his plan. You hear the voice of the enemy telling you that you have ruined everything, that you can never go back, that your story is over. But the enemy is a liar. Because in the hands of God, nothing is wasted. No mistake is too great for him to redeem. No detour is beyond his ability to turn into the very road that leads to your destiny. Look at the story of Jacob. He was born grasping at the heel of his brother, striving, always striving, always striving. He wanted the blessing. He wanted the birthright. And he was willing to deceive, to manipulate, to do whatever it took to get it. He tricked his father. He stole from his brother. And then he ran. He spent years in exile, years far from home, years in the service of another man. It looked like his past had determined his future, that his deception had set his course. But God had not forgotten him. And when the time came, he called him back. He wrestled with him. He changed his name. No longer Jacob, the deceiver. Now Israel, the one who strives with God. The one who was once known for deception became the father of a nation. The past that should have disqualified him became the testimony that revealed the power of God's grace. And what about Samson? A man chosen from birth, set apart, anointed with strength beyond any other. He had a calling. He had a destiny. But he squandered it. He played games with the enemy. He gave his heart to the wrong people. He revealed the secret of his strength. And in the end, he was captured. His eyes were gouged out. He was made a slave, grinding grain in the prison of his enemies. It looked like it was over. The anointing was gone. The calling was wasted. But in that prison, something happened. His hair began to grow again. And in his final moment, in his weakest state, he cried out to God, and God answered. The man who had fallen, the man who had failed, accomplished more in his final act than he had in all his years of strength. His failure was not the end of his story. It became the very thing God used for his purpose. And then there's Naomi. She left the land of Israel with her husband and sons, seeking a better life. But instead of prosperity, she found loss. Her husband died. Her sons died. She was left with nothing. She returned to her homeland with only her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and she was filled with bitterness. "Call me Mara," she said, "for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." She believed her story was over. She believed she had lost everything, but she did not see what God was doing. She did not see that Ruth, the Moabite woman who walked beside her, would become the grandmother of a king. She did not see that her story was not ending. It was only beginning. What she thought was emptiness was actually the preparation for a new blessing. And what about Peter? He had walked with the Messiah. He had seen the miracles. He had declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And yet, when the moment of testing came, he denied him. Not once, not twice. 3 times he swore that he did not know him. And when the rooster crowed, he went out and wept bitterly. He had failed in the worst way possible. He had turned his back on the one he loved the most. But after the resurrection, the Messiah sought him out. He asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And 3 times Peter answered, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." And 3 times he was given a commission. "Feed my sheep." The man who had denied him was now entrusted with leading his flock. His failure did not disqualify him. It prepared him. It made him humble. It made him dependent on grace. And on the day of Pentecost, it was Peter who stood up and preached the gospel with power, leading thousands to salvation. And then there's Paul, once Saul, the persecutor of the church, a man who had arrested believers, who had approved of their deaths, who had sought to destroy the very movement of God. If anyone should have been beyond redemption, it was him. And yet, on the road to Damascus, everything changed. He was struck blind, knocked to the ground, and confronted by the very one he had been opposing. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And in that moment, his past was transformed. The persecutor became the preacher. The enemy of the faith became its greatest champion. The man who once brought death now brought life. And the letters he wrote, the words of the one who had once been lost, are now the very foundation of Christian teaching. His past was not erased. It was redeemed. And so it is with you. The enemy tells you that you have gone too far, that your failures are final, that your sins have written the end of your story. But in the hands of God, your past is not a weight that holds you down. It is the very thing he will use to lift you up. The roads you walked that led you away will become the testimony that leads others home. The wounds you carry will become the proof of his healing power. The failures you thought had destroyed, you will become the very things that shape your destiny. Because in the hands of God, nothing is wasted. No mistake is beyond his redemption. No sin is beyond his grace. No past is beyond his power to turn it into a blessing.